Welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon on impoundment, impacts and options for reform. My name is Doug Crisatello. I'm a fellow here at Arnold Ventures, and I wanted to offer a few words about Arnold Ventures before jumping into our discussion of impoundment and how that topic has reemerged after largely being absent from public discourse for more than 50 years. Founded in 2008, Arnold Ventures is a nonpartisan philanthropy dedicated to improving the lives of all Americans through evidence-based policy solutions that maximize opportunity and minimize injustice. We focus on broken systems where outcomes are falling short, incentives are misaligned, and the time is right for change. Given that, it's hard to imagine a better topic for us to address than the US budget process, particularly at a time when our increasingly ineffective budgeting procedures are being challenged in new ways. These challenges are showing up in ways that put stress on key constitutional principles, including separation of powers related to the power of the purse and our system of checks and balances across branches of government. We're very pleased to co-sponsor this event with Reform for Results, a group formed last year to advance ideas aimed at reforming the US government to produce real-world results for the public. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Francis Fukuyama from that working group. Francis?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, but I managed to lose my voice coming here last night from California, so I will leave it to my colleague Ed to talk further about the group.
Great. Ed, were you gonna offer? We're gonna go right into the slides.
No, I'm gonna thank Frank for pulling the Reform for Results group together. And I want to also thank Arnold Ventures because Arnold has been a terrific partner in setting up this event. The members of the budget process working group at Reform for Results, Doug Crisatello, Terry Gullo, Roy Myers, Steve Redburn, and His Eminence, Phil Brooks, have done a wonderful job in pulling together heavy-duty technical documents, which they're not going to share with you today. You don't have to worry about that. What they're going to try to do, along with Eloise Pashakov, will be introduced later on, is to give you a good look at where impoundment stands and why it's important. I'm pleased to be here representing the Reform for Results group. We have other members of the group here today because we have a mandate to look at things like procurement, things like personnel, things like regulation within the federal government and figure out a way to bring reform to these things that are going on. The dynamic environment in which we find ourselves is the Chinese proverb, you're condemned to live in interesting times. We're certainly doing that. Let me introduce Phil Joyce, who will be our first speaker today and our moderator throughout. Phil is a distinguished professor at the University of Maryland and has previously worked at the Congressional Budget Office and written a seminal book on CBO. As he reminds us, it's the only book on CBO. Phil?
Thanks, Ed, very much. And what I'm going to try to do in the next 10 to 12 minutes is sort of offer a brief introduction to impoundment. Now, I say the next 10 to 12 minutes, and you should be very pleased that that happens because I'm a college professor and I tend to speak in 55-minute increments. But we have a lot to hear from our other panelists, so I'm going to try to keep this brief. So if we could move to the next slide. So just to start out, just a bit about the U.S. budget process. I'm sure this is not new to a lot of people, but I think we should remember that the Constitution gives the Congress the power of the purse. Why did the Constitution give the Congress the power of the purse? because the founders had just fought a revolution against the king. And so they were a bit wary of concentrated executive power. And so subsequently, there are a number of laws that form the basis for the federal budget process. There's the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which requires the president to submit a budget, also created what's now the Government Accountability Office. But then the really key one for our purposes is the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. And so that established, at least in Congress, the modern budget process. So essentially what happens is the president proposes a budget, and the Congress then considers that budget, passes bills that either raise revenue or spend money. Bills are sent to the president. The president signs those bills if he wants to, and they become law. And then the take care clause of the Constitution has been assumed to obligate the president to ensure that all those laws are carried out as the Congress intended. So the key question, and really a key question around impoundment, is do amounts provided by the Congress serve as ceilings, or are they precise levels that the Congress needs to comply with? Next slide, please. So before the 1974 Budget Act, impoundment was occasionally deployed, and we'll define impoundment more specifically in a couple of minutes. But it's essentially refusing to spend money that has been appropriated by Congress and signed into law. Mostly when impoundments occurred, they occurred for either efficiency reasons or because the law had explicitly permitted them to happen. So this highlights that there are really two very different kinds of circumstances that drive impoundments. There are routine actions by the executive branch to ensure, in effect, the efficiency of funds and savings when possible. There also are policy impoundments. And policy impoundments are where the president doesn't agree with the law and decides not to spend the money. So it's policy impoundments that are most at issue in our discussion. President Nixon was the one who sort of historically turbocharged the use of impoundments. He sought to withhold about $12 billion of appropriated funds. That's about 80 billion in today's dollars across a range of agencies. So when the courts weighed in, during the Nixon administration and since, they have regularly held that the president has no power to refuse to carry out activities funded by the Congress unless they infringe on specific presidential authority granted by the Constitution, such as the ability of the president to be commander-in-chief. So essentially, this means the president doesn't have the constitutional authority to substitute executive branch judgment for that of the Congress. The Impoundment Control Act, which was part of this 1974 act, set up fast-track procedures for consideration of presidential impoundments. It was not the Impoundment Control Act that said that impoundments were illegal. It was the law that said, and interpretation by the courts. What the Impoundment Control Act did was to set up a process for the president to follow if he wanted to propose impoundments. Next slide, please. You don't really get very far into the discussion of the history of impoundments before somebody brings up the gunboats. And so President Jefferson essentially, had an appropriation to purchase gunboats, and he didn't actually spend all the money. And proponents of the president's constitutional impoundment power say, aha, they point to this instance and they say, well, look, Jefferson had an appropriation higher than the amount of money that he spent, and therefore it must mean that impoundment is legal. But the language is clear. This basically created a ceiling on the amount of money that the president could spend. It did not sort of declare that he had to spend that amount of money. So it essentially said there were a number of gunboats up to that a level and an amount of money up to a level that the president could spend. So this was a case where presidential discretion to spend funds was specifically provided for in law. Next slide, please. So just to get our terms out of the way so we all are on the same page, impoundment. So you're not going to find anywhere, and Eloise can correct me if I'm wrong, anywhere in law where the word impoundment is defined explicitly. But impoundment has been described by OMB as, quote, any executive branch action or inaction that temporarily or permanently withholds, delays, or precludes the obligation of or expenditure of budgetary resources. So under the Impoundment Control Act, there are really two legal paths to impounding funds. One is a rescission, and a rescission is where the president actually requests Congress through what's called a special message to reduce budgetary resources, essentially to cancel an appropriation. And what happens in that case is the president can make a proposal. The Congress has 45 days of continuous session of Congress to respond to that by actually, passing a law which would cancel the appropriation. If the Congress fails to do that, the funds need to be made available. Then there's deferral, and deferral is a case where the president would have the authority to temporarily withhold funding, but that's for very specific reasons, and those specific reasons have to do with providing for contingencies, achieving savings from greater efficiency of operation, or if the law, as was true in the gunboats case, specifically provides for the president to be able to do that. But very clearly, that does not mean that the president can defer funds because of a policy disagreement. That is because the president just does not agree with the sort of underlying thing that the law is planning to do. GAO actually added a category known as programmatic delay. Programmatic delay is an unavoidable delay in spite of a good faith effort. So it includes things like if there was a requirement that you had to reach out to stakeholders and you just couldn't do that within the amount of time provided. The other term that I think it's useful for us to focus on is apportionment. Apportionment is where OMB actually takes funds and they provide them for obligation by dividing them up, usually by quarter over the fiscal year. This is a way of trying to make sure that agencies do not violate what is called the Anti-Deficiency Act. And the Anti-Deficiency Act essentially says that the executive branch can't spend money that hasn't been appropriated by the Congress or cannot overspend its appropriation. Next slide, please. GAO, under the Impoundment Control Act, has an important statutory role. If the president fails to follow the procedure to rescind or defer funds, the statute requires GAO to act. And so what does GAO do in this case? It must report to Congress any impoundment where the president has not notified the Congress. And this is something we'll come back to because it's something very much that is active right now. That GAO notification is supposed to serve the same purpose as if a special message had been transmitted. That is, the 45-day consideration period starts at that point. The law also permits the Comptroller General, the head of the GAO, to bring a suit to compel the release of funds. It does not require the Comptroller General to do that. Next slide, please. A couple of significant Supreme Court cases that relate to impoundment. One is Train versus City of New York, which was a 1975 case. The impoundment had actually occurred prior to the enactment of the Impoundment Control Act. But essentially, the administration argued that in this case, the EPA administrator was obligated to disperse funds, but did not have to actually spend all the funds that were made available as grants under the Clean Water Act. The court ruled that the law didn't authorize that discretion, and therefore this was an unlawful impoundment. And then the second, which is related to impoundment, but in a more indirect way, is the Clinton versus City of New York case, which came about after something passed called the Line Item Veto Act. And the Line Item Veto Act was actually not a line item veto. It was actually an enhanced form of rescission authority, which gave the president more power and essentially, without going into the convoluted details of the Line Item Veto Act, would have permitted the president and a minority of members of Congress to actually cancel an appropriation. And the court basically said you have to go through the same process of bicameralism and presentment that occurred in order to enact the appropriation to begin with if you want to cancel the appropriation. All right, that brings us to the current time, and it brings us to the return of impoundment. Impoundment had resurfaced under the prior Trump administration when the president unsuccessfully sought to withhold funds that were provided for Ukraine's security assistance. And so GAO, as it is supposed to under the law, actually ended up with a finding that this was an illegal impoundment. And what they said explicitly was, faithful execution of the law does not permit the president to substitute his own policy priorities for those the Congress has enacted into law. OMB withheld funds for a policy reason, which is not permitted under the Impoundment Control Act. The withholding was not a programmatic delay, and this is an important distinction. OMB had argued this is just a programmatic delay, which should be permissible, and GAO said, no, it is not a programmatic delay. These funds were withheld for a policy reason. And then in the 2024 campaign, there was the notion very clearly that was put out there of repealing impoundment controls. And the assertion was that essentially for the first 200 years before the Impoundment Control Act, impoundment had been legal, and it was the Impoundment Control Act that made it illegal. As I suggested earlier, I don't think that's a sort of clear ruling of what had actually occurred. And even before the 1974 Act, there were substantial legal concerns about the authority of the president to impound funds. And the clearest case here is a memo from William Rehnquist, who was later the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. At that point, was in President Nixon's Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, who said, it seems an anomalous proposition that because the executive branch is bound to execute the laws, it is free to decline to execute them. So that brings us to the issues that we are currently confronting. As most of you know, OMB very soon after, within a week of the president being inaugurated, had paused all funding, which raised concerns about Impoundment Control Act violations. It did not send a special message to the Congress proposing deferrals or rescissions. In addition, the abolition of various agencies or the wholesale dismissal of staff raises impoundment questions. In many other cases, grants or contracts have been terminated or paused. I should be clear here that there is a current rescission proposal before the Congress. It's $9.3 billion, which is relatively small in the context of the overall budget. And interestingly, there have been cases such as in the Department of Homeland Security, where an agency has been accused of both violating the Impoundment Control Act, meaning withholding funds that the Congress had appropriated, and also the Anti-Deficiency Act simultaneously, where money is being spent, particularly about issues at the border, which are for different purposes or in greater amounts that had been provided for by the Congress. GAO has said that it has 39 ongoing investigations of Impoundment Control Act violations. And the first of these decisions came down on May the 22nd, with GAO ruling that the Department of Transportation withholding of funds for electric vehicles was, in fact, an unlawful deferral. So that brings us sort of to where we are now, and it brings us to our panel discussion. And so what I want to do now is I want to introduce the three very knowledgeable and distinguished panelists that we have that are going to help us to sort of sort through these issues from the perspective of the law, from the perspective of the Congress, and from the perspective of the executive branch. And so I have a series of questions I'm going to ask each of them, but I want to introduce them first. So first, we have Eloise Pasikoff. Eloise is a professor at Georgetown Law, and she is a specialist in administrative law and appropriations law, and we are thrilled to have Eloise join us. Secondly, we have Charles Kiefer. Charles Kiefer was staff director of the Senate Appropriations Committee under several chairs, Senator Byrd, Senator Mikulski, Senator Leahy. He also spent 16 years at OMB prior to that. And then we have Doug Criscitello, who you heard from previously. Doug, as he said, is a fellow here at Arnold Ventures. He's also a former OMB and CBO official and also worked at the New York City Independent Budget Office. So thanks all of you for joining us. I'm going to start with a question to Eloise. And the question is, what are the legal arguments for and against the administration position on impoundment? Which do you find persuasive, and how do you think the Supreme Court might utilize?
Great, thanks for that question. I'm delighted to be here. Hello to everybody watching and listening at home. So I want to talk about 4 different kinds of arguments that the administration has been making. I'm going to talk about constitutional arguments, statutory arguments, regulatory arguments, and then procedural hurdles in court. And so the top line thing that I'll say is that the constitutional arguments are the most dramatic and expansive ones, but they're not focusing on those in court. They're focusing on the other arguments in court for the most part. I don't think the Supreme Court, I cannot see 5 votes for the constitutional arguments that the administration proponents of an appellate power are making. But I don't think that's where we're headed. I think really the statutory and regulatory and procedural arguments are the current name of the game. And so while I'm going to talk about the constitutional arguments, I want to really flag that I don't think those are the ones that the courts are going to be kind of focused on the most. And I do not think that that's going to be what the Supreme Court has to handle first. So briefly, just to run through the constitutional arguments. When we talk about constitutional arguments, we're usually talking about a combination of text and structure, of history and tradition, and precedent. And so the proponents of a strong presidential empowerment power in the administration are making arguments along all of those lines. As a textual matter, they point to a handful of clauses in Article 2 of the Constitution that defines the executive power, and they read them very expansively in line with what seems to be a trend in the Supreme Court towards a much more sort of unitary executive theory. And so the proponents are really trying to capitalize on this much broader read. So for example, they look at the vesting clause in Article 2 and say, well, the vesting clause says that all executive power resides in the president. The president has enforcement discretion. Impoundment is kind of like enforcement discretion. There's no way that the executive branch can possibly enforce all of the laws to their utmost. And similarly, they say impoundment power is similar. You shouldn't have to, spend all of the money up to the max. They also look at the take care clause of the Article 2. It's the president's job to take care that the law be faithfully executed. And they argue that there's actually a variety of laws in play at any given time when the president has to make adjustments possibly conflicting laws. So for example, we just heard a little bit about the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says you can't overspend. And so the president has to have the authority, goes the argument, to impound in order to prevent overspending. There's a Politico story today about how OMB is also now withholding some funds against the argument that we're about to hit the debt ceiling. And so slowing down spending or stopping spending is necessary on that ground too. So I think this features into this whole idea that the take care clause gives the president a bunch of authority to kind of make adjustments across possibly conflicting laws. There's 2 other clauses that they rely on. One is the commander-in-chief clause, which places the president as the commander-in-chief of the military. And it's not really a clause so much as the foreign affairs power drawn from a number of clauses in Article 2. And they say, okay, so the president needs strong commander-in-chief authority, the president needs strong authority over foreign affairs, and so therefore we need to read an additional impoundment authority as to finances in those 2 categories. So the opposite argument is just that none of those clauses can be read to say what the administration proponents say that they say. Take care that the law be faithfully executed means take care that the law be faithfully executed. Appropriations law are law. There's sort of no discretionary power to change language or to change words in an appropriations law. There's just no difference in that. The vesting clause does vest executive power in the president, but impoundment is not like enforcement discretion. Enforcement discretion, in fact, relies on funding. That's exactly why you have enforcement discretion, because you can't possibly have the money to enforce all the laws up to the full maximum. And so impoundment is just not analogous in any way. And then finally, as to the commander-in-chief and the foreign affairs power, the idea is that, okay, maybe there's some limitations on what Congress can control in those arenas, but most of what we're fighting about in the spending space right now is actually domestic, not necessarily related to those 2 withholding powers. And in any event, nothing in those powers suggests that Congress can't, if the president needs money to accomplish those goals, Nothing in Article 2 suggests that Congress doesn't have the authority to limit those things. But I want to be very clear. These are the arguments that the proponents in the administration made in kind of think tank, white papers and so forth, and have been saying, here and there in hearings and so forth. But they're not the arguments that the administration is leaning on in court for the most part. And so the arguments that the administration is leaning on in court are statutory, and then also to some extent procedural. And I think this makes sense because I don't think that the Supreme Court would buy the constitutional case, even under kind of the stronger version of unitary executive theory that we are trending towards. I have a hard time seeing how there are 5 votes in the Supreme Court for this extremely, dramatic version of what the spending power applies, especially against the backdrop of contested historical debates that we heard a little bit about in the previous context, and the different ways of reading the precedent. I just don't, I can get into that more if we want to, but I just don't see how there are 5 votes against to support the administration's reading of the text, the history and tradition, and the precedents. So what I think are more complicated are the statutory arguments and the procedural roadblocks that the administration is throwing up. And this is because the statutory arguments are one by one, resting on the individual language of individual appropriations provisions and individual underlying authorizing statutory language, which just have to be read individually and extremely carefully. And so it's very difficult to make a global statement about what is or is not authorized because you're fighting over individual micro provisions. And so, for example, the OMB director votes told Congress last week that, in fact, they're not impounding anything, that they are following the law, and that they read all of what they're withholding as being part of this kind of programmatic delay concept that GAO has worked out. That's not in the statute, it's not in the Impoundment Control Act. But the idea behind programmatic delay is that there are underlying statutory flexibilities, or let me actually say, so one original idea of programmatic delay is what Phil was just telling us about, which is that there's sort of like external reasons why you can't spend the money. And we also just heard about how GAO, during the first Trump administration, held that the slowdown, the kind of withholding through apportionments of DoD money to Ukraine was an illegal impoundment. And that is true, DoD did hold that. I'm sorry, GAO did hold that. But GAO also reviewed another set of apportionment slowdowns that OMB did at the exact same time with just a different pot of money, State Department money. And GAO held that the underlying authorities that governed the State Department money actually did allow the president discretion. And so the very same OMB action, putting a hold on the apportionments, was an impermissible impoundment as to the DoD money, but was a perfectly permissible programmatic delay under the State Department money. And then they subsequently went on to, I actually think it was slightly reversed. They also held, in addition, that the Biden administration's hold on spending money at the wall was also a permissible programmatic delay. So this programmatic delay concept has grown quite a lot and is sort of eating up what is actually in the statute at the Impoundment Control Act as to the rescission and deferral provision. But the point is that it is a case-by-case, specific provision by specific provision argument as to whether the individual statutes allow this kind of non-spending. And so that's a fight that's happening in court in dozens and dozens of cases, but they're not macro, they're all about the individual provisions. There's one other statutory argument that the administration is making that they say kind of will allow them to withhold the money without violating the Impoundment Control Act. And that is this idea they've created called a pocket rescission. A pocket rescission is akin to a pocket veto, and it's basically running out the clock. So the idea that the administration has proffered, and they tried to do this in the first Trump administration as well, is that if you propose rescissions to Congress late in the fiscal year, Congress won't have enough time to act on the rescission proposal before the end of the fiscal year and the funding runs out. So it's sort of like a backdoor way of accomplishing that goal. And so they argue that this is in keeping because there's no time frame listed in the Impoundment Control Act. Their argument is that this is in keeping with actually what the Impoundment Control Act says. Now, GAO disagrees. I think GAO has the better reading there, right? The ICA does say that the money shall be made available unless Congress has approved the rescission. And so in a position where Congress hasn't approved the rescission, I think the money has to be made available. It also, I think, does seem to violate this provision from the precedent of not allowing one house to veto. You need to actually pass a new law that goes through both houses of Congress and signed by the president. And so I think the idea of pocket rescissions does violate that constitutional idea. But in any event, that's an argument that they're making. They're not saying that, well, we won't comply with the Impoundment Control Act. They're saying we are complying and this is the way we're complying. Okay, so that's the set of the statutory arguments. There's a regulatory argument on which they're relying too, and they're relying on the regulatory argument in part to do all of the funding cutoffs through grants that they're doing. So it used to be, before the first Trump administration, that if the administration or an agency wanted to cut off grant funding from a grantee unilaterally, that is without the consent of the grantee, that there were only two ways that the agency could do it. You could only cut off funds if the grantee violated the terms and conditions of the underlying award, or for cause, right? There was some additional for cause bad action that the grantee did. So in 2020, after having been thwarted by a number of courts and trying to cut off grant funding during that time, the Trump administration, through OMB's centralized grants rules, changed the governing rule, and allowed, deleted the for cause provision, and instead inserted a provision where the administration could cut off a grant, and I'm quoting here, if an award no longer effectuates the program goals or agency priorities. And so that's the language that's in all of the grant cutoff letters that have been going out. And so again, they're saying, look, we're following the law. We're complying with the law on the books. The Biden administration did roll this change back, but late in the Biden administration. So most of the funding that's at issue now is funding under the old rule. And the Biden administration didn't even roll it back all the way. They only rolled it back a little bit. So I think this is another sort of issue that's out there with what the challenge of whether it's like a totally clear violation of everything. Now, it is true that the cutoffs still have to be in keeping with the overall statutory language. You can't be unfettered presidential priorities, but this is still nonetheless an issue. Okay, the last set of legal things I want to say is that in court, where these dozens of lawsuits are being heard, there's usually two stages of kinds of arguments in any court case. You have procedural hurdles at the front end before you get to the merits argument on the back end. And I've just been talking about the merits arguments, right? Like, is this unconstitutional? Does this violate the statute? Those are actual, is this illegal questions? Those are the merits questions. But before you can get to the merits questions, you have to pass through a lot of procedural hurdles in order to get there. And the administration is heavily relying on a lot of these procedural hurdles. So some of these will sound familiar to folks, like standing, right? There has to be a person who's injured for whom fixing the thing that they're complaining about would redress their problems. So in some of the cases, for example, the administration is arguing that the plaintiffs aren't the right plaintiffs to bring this case, that it's really the sub-grantees who are being harmed here, or that fixing the thing that the plaintiffs are complaining about wouldn't actually put the money back on the table, in which case there's a mismatch between the claim and whether it's actually redressable in this lawsuit. So that's a set of standing challenges that the courts are sorting through on a case-by-case basis. There's also reviewability arguments. Is this kind of thing even the kind of matter that a court can review? So there's a principle in administrative law of agency discretion. And the idea is that there are some things that Congress has committed to agency discretion that courts don't have a standard for evaluating. And so the administration is arguing in a number of these cases that the thing at issue is committed to agency discretion and is not reviewable by the courts. A third procedural hurdle is whether these kinds of claims, especially in the grant context, can be heard at all in the ordinary federal court kind of case, or whether these are merely breach of contract claims that can only be heard in the Court of Federal Claims. And if these are cases that can only be heard in the Court of Federal Claims, all that the plaintiffs would be able to get is back pay, basically. Sort of like, you broke our contract, and now give us the damages, give us the money that you owe us. None of the broader claims about kind of the underlying statutes or the underlying the more general principle in administrative law of agency decisions being arbitrary and capricious, none of those can be heard in the Court of Federal Claims kinds of cases. And so kind of the scope of even what you can be arguing will deeply, deeply matter in depending on which kind of court you can be in. The Supreme Court has recently given some signals that it thinks that many of these cases are actually not ordinary federal court cases, but are just the Court of Federal Claims cases, and that would completely change the nature of a lot of these. The last kind of procedural hurdle that I'll talk about is the principle of finality. So you can only challenge, plaintiffs can only challenge in court final agency action. And a lot of what the administration has been arguing as to some of these withholdings is that we're considering, it's a process, it's ongoing. We haven't made any final agency decisions. We're thinking about what to do with the money. You know, we're reviewing under our discretionary authority that we think the statutes give us. And so if that's the case, then these are additional hurdles to getting in court. So really these procedural claims, these procedural hurdles are a way of getting at the substantive outcome that you want without making the big constitutional argument. So again, I'm deeply skeptical that the court would ultimately buy the constitutional argument, but I don't think those are the cases that are going to get to the Supreme Court first. And the Supreme Court, I think, depending on what comes up, you know, it's an open question about whether the court would buy the individual specific statutory claims, because it's so specific as to what the provisions are. One last thing I'll say before I'll stop talking. Courts are deeply limited in the appropriations law space, as courts are deeply limited in general. You can only consider the narrow claims that are brought to you against the particular facts that are raised, and courts look at issues one by one without necessarily looking at the whole picture. The question is there a facially reasonable argument why the administration might want to do this particular thing? And can we find some sort of provision of law that might support it? Okay, without seeing the broader context of everything. And so I think this is, again, I'll just sort of, I'm delighted that we have our friend from Congress here who's gonna talk about Article 1, because I really think that in the appropriations space, it's Congress who has the bigger picture and the authority to do most of the overwhelming work that needs to be done in terms of using appropriations as an important check and balance. Courts are just limited in this way.
So there are some obvious options that are suggested for sort of reforms. I think what I want to do is maybe come back and ask all the panelists about that, you know, sort of later on, because you've written on this, but other people may have had ideas as well. And I would like, since you gave such a good segue, to turn to Charles. And you know what I'd like Charles to do, and you can do this in whatever order you want. I have a couple of questions, or you can say this is not the question you should ask. You should ask me another question. But the two things that I would love to hear about are how you think the appropriations committees are likely to respond as they're working on the FY26 appropriation bills. And also the sort of broader issue of whether you see the appropriations committees eventually sort of standing up for themselves in light of what is a clear challenge to the appropriations power. You know, there used to be this saying among political scientists that there were three parties in Congress. There were the Republicans, the Democrats, and the appropriators, and the appropriators tended to sort of stick together. But you haven't heard a lot of pushback from the Republican appropriators, at least that I've sort of, you know, seen here. So I'm just curious about your response to all of that.
Thank you. First of all, I would stress that this is not an academic exercise. This affects every one of you from the moment you wake up in the morning until you go to bed. In March, Congress sent the president an appropriations bill. The president signed it, providing $1.7 trillion for specific purposes. Is your food safe? Are your drugs safe? Is your air clean? Is your water clean? When you get in a plane, is there somebody in the FAA tower who can land you or get you to take off safely? When you drive to work, are your roads bumpy or are they not? If you are in a transit system, does your bus and subway work? National security. We spend nearly $1 trillion a year. Which weapons systems are the most appropriate? To what extent do you invest in the troops and their families? We have millions of veterans, many of whom rely on our healthcare system, VA healthcare system. Do we invest appropriately in those systems to make sure that those veterans get the care that they deserve? All of those decisions are made as part of the appropriations process, where in the past, as Eloise has said, and Phil has said, at least for the last 50 years, it has been well established that it is Congress with the power of the purse under Title I of the Constitution that has that responsibility. The Trump administration is asserting now is that Congress is not the decider, that when an appropriations is made, that it is a ceiling, and that they have the authority to spend less on veterans or on climate change or on foreign aid. So it is absolutely critical to the life that you live, how these decisions are made. And my biased view is that when the founding fathers created the Constitution, they did not want to have a monarch. They wanted to have a president who was subject to decisions by Congress, and that the people, the congressmen and the senators are closer to the people and what their needs are. To answer your question directly, we have a Republican House and a Republican Senate. They are giving President Trump the space currently to pursue Mr. Vogt's strategy of being able to impound funds. My sense is that we're going to have some pain for that dynamic changes. That pain will come, and then the dynamic will change. Right now, one of the key factors in writing an appropriations bill, the vast majority of decisions are reflected in what's called report language. It's not actually in the statute. I do expect in drafting the fiscal 2026 appropriations bills, you're going to be seeing a great deal more detail provided explicitly in the bill as differentiated from the report, which Congress will then argue gives it greater standing when the administration is asserting an authority to impound those funds. But it's going to take time. I think we're going to have to go through this cycle to see what kinds of things are impounded and where the pain is. Oftentimes, and this is true of both parties, presidents of both parties and Congresses of both parties, if you have a president in your party, you can go to the president and say, hey, I got to have this or I can't have this. So don't impound that. Right now, Republicans are doing some of that. In fact, there was a hearing a few weeks ago where Congressman Cole, who was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, noted that he had called OMB to complain about the closing of a Social Security district office in his district. He was able to keep that office open. Well, that can work for the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, but it cannot work for the 434 other members of the House or most of the members of the Senate. So the normal give and take of the political process is not going to solve this problem. So again, Republican leadership of the House, the Senate is giving President Trump and Mr. Vogt some latitude right now, but over time, I suspect Congress will reassert its power. But it's not going to be this year. We're going to have to go through this year's cycle and to see what doesn't get done. The other point I would argue, as someone who's been intimately involved in writing appropriations bills for years, is the give and take of how you write an appropriations bill is dependent on knowing that when you've made a decision, it's done. If you're in the ag appropriations bill and you're trying to decide how much to spend on agricultural research that affects a particular region that happens to be in a red state, you might have a discussion about, well, I'll give you that if maybe you'll spend a little bit more on the women, infants, and children nutrition program or on the elderly feeding program. Those trade-offs work when you know that the final decision is final. But if you don't know that, and OMB or the executive agencies are going to second guess the decisions that are in those appropriations bills, it is going to make the ability to finish the appropriations process all the more difficult, which sadly will, and I think there's a high probability of this, contribute to doing more appropriating through continuing resolutions, which is an abominable way to spend $1.7 trillion. Happy to respond to questions.
So well, I have one follow-up question, which is, specifically, I had talked in the introduction about this rescission proposal that is up there now.
9.4 billion, yes, sir.
Right, and we are hearing, that there are people, in both houses, Republicans in both houses, that are saying, well, we're not sure we quite agree with sort of the specifics of this. Now, always has suggested that, if that's an approach, that if that approach isn't successful, then OMB will move on to Plan B, whatever Plan B is. But I'm curious whether you have any sense of whether you think that the Congress will end up approving these rescissions, or kind of what the process will look like.
Fair question, thank you. First of all, it's ironic that OMB Director Vogt has testified that he believes the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. But now he is sending up a set of rescissions pursuant to the Impoundment Control Act. I'm happy he did it, but there is some curious development there. He has, Doge, John, I will show all my bias against Doge. They started with the promise that they would save $2 trillion. They reduced that promise to $1 trillion. And now they send up a special message proposing rescissions totaling $9.4 billion on decimal dust. The whole math concept of Doge of saving $2 trillion out of a budget that totals $6.7 trillion a year is folly, because you can't address $2 trillion annual deficits without dealing with Social Security and Medicare and mandatory, and whether or not we tax citizens fairly. But I'm happy he sent up the 9.4 billion. It's in the Rules Committee as we speak. The rumor is that the House will take up HR 4 on Thursday. We'll see whether it passes. I have heard that there is some Republican objections to rescinding the $1 billion for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds National Public Radio and Public Broadcasting System. One of President Bush 43's great success stories of his 8 years was creating the PEPFAR program, which provides HIV/AIDS assistance across the globe. That's on the rescission list. So we'll see whether or not the House passes the exact thing proposed by the president. It wouldn't surprise me if they modify it a little bit. Under the Impoundment Control Act, the Congress has the authority to propose alternatives. They don't have to do the 9.4 billion precisely as the president proposed it. And the Senate, normally a bill can be filibustered in the Senate, but under the Impoundment Control Act, it's a majority vote. If the Appropriations Committee doesn't act within 25 days of continuous session, someone can discharge the committee from jurisdiction and bring the bill directly to the floor. The parliamentarian has ruled pursuant to the Impoundment Control Act that the Senate would have to act by July 18th. Or the end of the 45 days of continuous session. So if they don't act by July 18th and then reconcile with the House, the funds have to be obligated. And then we'll have one of our big first tests of this entire impoundment question is, again, the president proposed this 9.4 billion pursuant to the Impoundment Control Act, which requires him to obligate the funds if they are not rescinded within 45 days of continuous session. So if the 45 days come and go, will he in fact obligate the funds? Open question. It's good that he proposed it. It's going to go through that process. I have a hunch Congress will pass a $9.4 billion rescission bill. I have a hunch it will have different components. In 1995, Speaker Gingrich took over the House. The House Republicans produced a $15 billion rescission bill. President Clinton didn't like it. He put his foot down, posed alternative rescissions, and a rescission bill was signed into law in 1995, rescinding $15 billion, but it was different from what had been done by the House Republicans. Congress has that authority, and they can negotiate with the president and sign something. We'll see whether that happens. But again, the real question that I'm interested in is, will the president obligate any money proposed for rescission that does not get enacted?
Well, and what you just suggested, I would just add that what you just suggested is the norm, meaning that if you look at the statistics that were compiled by GAO, what they show is that the Congress has actually rescinded far greater amounts than presidents have proposed over the years.
Absolutely.
But what has tended to happen is that they have substituted their own rescissions for those proposed by presidents, but they have essentially doubled down on, on what presidents have done in many cases, rescinding even more in terms of dollar amounts than presidents have proposed, but sort of not the same dollar.
Absolutely correct. In an average year, Congress will rescind $8, $9, $10 billion because they get to count that when an appropriations subcommittee gets its 302B allocation, which is a cap on spending for that subcommittee. They may decide that they, if it's 50 billion, they may have $52 billion of things that they want to spend money on. But if they do $2 billion of rescissions, then they can spend the 52 billion. So they have an incentive to identify wasteful spending and enact it into law without having compulsions from the president. But you're 100% correct. Congress has way outperformed presidents since enactment of the Budget Act in 1974 in terms of enacting rescissions.
Great. Thanks, Charles. I really appreciate it. So I feel like we're an embodiment of the separation of powers here. We've heard about the courts and we've heard about the Congress, and now we're going to hear about the sort of effects on the executive branch. So I want to ask Doug, focusing primarily on the executive branch, we can talk about anything you want to, the sort of effects of the impoundments on the FY25 and FY26 budget processes, and what you see as the effect of the cancellations have on sort of the operations of the executive branch in general.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Phil. Most importantly, at the highest level, our system of government works in a way that the Congress makes the laws, provides the funding, and the executive branch executes those laws. And by execute, I mean administer, right? Not the other definition. So the current year has been enormously challenging for those in government who are focused on minimizing and eliminating the waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars. Ideally, funds are provided upfront. The federal fiscal year starts October 1st. Ideally, you have your budget in place. You develop a funds control and disbursement plan. You sort of fan out and ensure that your systems and your recipients, your future recipients of these funds are lined up, checks are done. Our congressional process is just not allowing that to happen. So the folks in this room, I like to ask the question, when's the last time the Congress passed all of its funding measures on time? And that was 1997. So it hasn't even happened in the 21st century. So federal financial managers are forced on a year-by-year basis to scramble. This year has taken it to a different level. Charles mentioned difficulty, the abomination of continuing resolutions. And those are the measures that are used to sort of keep the government on life support while funding packages are being negotiated on the Hill and between the Hill and the White House. This year we had 3 continuing resolutions. So it's worth noting again the disruptive nature of budgeting in the current year. Our first CR was just to get us through the first few months of the year, through the presidential election. We then had another short-term CR that stretched through mid-March. Meanwhile, we did have that election. We had a new executive come in and Phil, as you pointed out, immediately issued a funding pause memo, which was later rescinded. But even that, here you are as a government agency, you're operating under the short-term measure. Let's say you're at the end of January. You have enough money for about 6 more weeks, and you're being told to hold up on spending. You don't even have full year spending in place. It's a very awkward thing. So even if the president had come in and proposed rescissions, I'm not sure how that would have worked because they were operating, the Congress was trying to figure out how much money to provide to the executive branch. So it's sort of awkward to consider changes to something that hasn't really occurred yet. So again, more complications for federal financial managers. One thing I wanted to point out is the impoundments that we're talking about apply only to discretionary programs. So the largest expenditure items in the budget are not discretionary. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, those are not discretionary spending items. There was a time, if you go back 100 years, I think this is a safe statement, all spending was discretionary. When the Impoundment Control Act was put in place in 1974, 51% of spending was discretionary. Today, based on a fine paper I read this morning, 28% of discretionary spending is, or of all spending is discretionary. So, I pointed out that I could get into why operating under a continuing resolution is difficult, but just not having the certainty of how much money you have to spend over the next year just throws all kinds of wrenches in the works for smooth government operations. It leads to waste, fraud, and abuse. Operating under a short-term CR does nothing but sort of keeps the government on life support while it's waiting for its broader funding package. We've talked about pocket rescissions. Alois, you mentioned that. It appears that's where we may be headed. Maybe additional rescissions get proposed, but you have to keep in mind, we're only 15, 16 weeks away from the end of the fiscal year. It ends September 30. We're quickly getting there, right? So GAO has ruled time and time again that the executive branch must ensure prudent obligation of funds during their availability. And allowing the funds to lapse just isn't something that can be done legally. Again, as someone that's worked for quite a few years in the executive branch, we worked so diligently to ensure that our directives from the Congress, as required by the Constitution, were satisfied by our actions. So, there would be, again, ideally you have a funding plan to take you through the year to ensure that the desire by the Congress, and importantly, the Congress in a bill signed by the president, right? It's a joint measure. It's not just the Congress directing the White House what to do. A few items that have been mentioned that I just wanted to sort of concur with. There's been very significant staff departures across the government this year. That has implications for impoundment. If staff is cut to such an extent that funding provided by Congress just can't be dispersed in a responsible manner, GAO has ruled that constitutes impoundment. Eloise, you mentioned there's been a lot of disruption around grants. This notion of a new president coming in and sending out a directive that says only spend money that aligns with the following executive orders that I'm going to issue. I mean, again, it's contrary to our constitutional system of government. As someone, again, that's worked in the executive branch, there were programs I worked on that I knew the political officials in the agency opposed, but it was a done deal. Congress passed a law, the president signed it, it was up to us to deliver it. I also wanted to mention that a number of administrative processes are becoming politicized, approvals in particular across government, whether it's apportionments at OMB, payments at the Treasury Department, or even notices of funding opportunities. We're starting to see political appointees engage at points where they haven't in the past. I don't necessarily have a huge problem with that philosophically. I'm just saying it leads to a less efficient government. So I think I'll leave it.
Thanks, Doug. So I wanted to, Eloise wrote a great article, which I will commend to all of you if you're interested, and it's called Modernizing the Power of the Purse Statutes. It's in the George Washington Law Review. Now, the reason I mention that is because one of the things that she did in there, one of the purposes of writing the article, is to talk about ways that these laws, and the two laws she was talking about were the Anti-Deficiency Act and the Impoundment Control Act. And I want to focus on the Impoundment Control Act. And I wonder if Eloise could sort of lead us here, kind of tease some of these things up, and then maybe other people could sort of respond to it. You know, what are, you know, some of the key places where if we wanted to see sort of amendments to the Impoundment Control Act to make the Impoundment Control Act operate in a better, clearer way, you know, given that it's not 1974 anymore, you know, what are some of those things that you would point to?
Sure. I will begin by saying that all law reform in part depends on the idea that you have a good faith partner in the executive branch. So there is just a limit on what law reform can do when you have sort of a different idea about what law reform means. That having been said, let me walk through a handful of ideas that I have proposed for making changes to the Impoundment Control Act to at least better account for some of what the modern era has brought to us, the contemporary era. So first is, I think that the programmatic delay idea is just a bad one. And I think it is atextual, and it runs right through what Congress was trying to do with the Impoundment Control Act. The whole point about getting information from, so the Impoundment Control Act talks about rescissions and deferrals, and programmatic delay is a species of deferral that you just don't have to report to Congress. Because it's like saying, we're not going to spend this money, but we also don't need to tell you that we're not going to spend this money. But the problem with programmatic delay, as it has been worked out through GAO interpretation and current use of it, is that it basically means that nothing gets reported to Congress, and the executive branch can basically, you know, stretch statutory meaning to try to say we're in compliance, we're in compliance, we're in compliance. Where actually, whether or not the executive branch is actually in compliance with whatever the terms of the statute say, that's not necessarily all that Congress would want to know about. Congress might actually want to weigh in on the idea that, okay, well, like nominally you're in compliance, but actually we kind of really want you to do this thing. We see that we didn't really speak clearly enough or whatever. And so the idea of programmatic delay is that it can be just so badly misused. And I think this does sort of cross both parties. So my idea for reform would be that Congress should just clearly write out the idea of programmatic delay. I don't think it's what was contemplated in the original act. I think it would be perfectly easy to send up kind of like batch deferral notices in a modern technological era. where there, could be like the apportionment database that the administration has also taken down, which Congress required a couple of years ago through appropriations law. That could serve the purpose of a lot of this stuff. So it wouldn't have to be super complicated. It could be just done in one fell swoop. So getting rid of programmatic delay is one suggestion I would have. A second suggestion I would have is that just clearly explain that pocket rescission is not allowed. So there could just be a date certain by which all rescission requests would have to be made. And to do otherwise would be to violate the clear expectations of Congress. So another idea is borrowed from the Anti-Deficiency Act. So the Anti-Deficiency Act and the Impoundment Control Act are basically two ends of Congress's control over the purse. The Anti-Deficiency Act says on the one hand, you can't spend what we haven't given you, you can't spend more than we have given you, you can't spend it in advance before we've given you anything. And the Impoundment Control Act says, oh yeah, and by the way, spend what we've given you. And so they're sort of, they fit together in a bunch of ways. But the Anti-Deficiency Act has penalties written in for non-compliance. So if you're a civil servant and your boss is telling you to do something that violates the Anti-Deficiency Act, you can say with a little more confidence, I can't do that because I could be held personally liable, either with I could face civil penalties, I could even face criminal penalties. Those have actually never happened, but they provide an incentive for a civil servant to be able to say, I can't do this thing that you are asking me to do because it's illegal. So the Impoundment Control Act doesn't have anything like that. And so the system itself is skewed towards like the compliance with the Anti-Deficiency Act as opposed to compliance with the Impoundment Control Act. So I would say imposing a penalty provision in the Impoundment Control Act would be a good idea. Again, the point is not actually to punish civil servants for just trying to do their job. That's not how the penalties in the Anti-Deficiency Act work either. They work as incentives to try to ensure compliance with the law. Civil servants want to comply with the law. This is basically what Doug was just telling us. So the Impoundment Control Act penalty provisions, if they were to exist, would be to protect civil servants. They would not be to punish civil servants. Another proposal I would have about amending the Impoundment Control Act would be to deeply kind of like reaffirm GAO's role in the process and to provide some more deadlines for investigations and so forth. And so we may talk a little bit more about sort of how GAO is being treated as a partisan actor in the current era with by the administration after the first GAO decision against the administration came out. I don't think that's the case. I'm happy to say a little bit more about that later, but in any event, clarifying that GAO really is there to help Congress investigate and to ensure compliance with funds. I think that would be another good idea. So I'll leave it at that and open things up.
All right, so what I want to do is ask the other two panelists if they have any reaction in terms of whether any of these ideas that Eloise has thrown out that you find particularly appealing or important. And then we have actually a number of questions from people from the audience, and I would like to, out of respect, basically turn to some of those questions. But first, I want to see whether you have any reaction to these sort of reform ideas, either Doug or Charles.
Certainly, civilian penalties for the violating the Impoundment Control Act is extremely worthy concept. Because right now, the executive branch is just blowing past them. They think they can just look the other way. One other possibility, depending on what OMB does over the next 4 months, would be to extend the availability of any funds that lapse on September 30th as a result of action or inaction by the executive branch, just to keep alive the concept that these things are supposed to be spent. And that the president cannot unilaterally make the money go away by simply letting it lapse.
And yeah, I agree. I would highly recommend Eloise's piece from last year, modernizing the power of the purse statutes. Great reform ideas in there. I just wanted to emphasize one point. Interest on the overall budget fiscal condition of the U.S. today. We're spending more on interest on the national debt than we are on the Department of Defense. That's a problem. Interest payments are out of control. It's sort of like if your interest on your credit card every month was greater than your mortgage payment, you'd probably be concerned. That's sort of what we're up against here. So I think you can be extremely concerned about the country's fiscal outlook, yet still be very committed to the rule of law, the separation of powers, checks and balances, and power of the purse. So that's the concern here. We all want to get the US on a more sustainable fiscal footing, but we need to do it in a way where we adhere to the Constitution.
Good example of that, just to lay out a few
Mhm.
numbers. The notion in Doge is that you can address the deficit by attacking the federal workforce, which is essentially the main thing that they did by either firing employees or paying them not to work. The civilian workforce budget for the entire federal government is $400 billion. So if you eliminated the entire civilian workforce, everybody, VA hospitals, federal prison guards, everybody, FAA controllers, eliminated them all, the current $2 trillion annual deficit would only be reduced by $400 billion. So the notion that you can take on our $2 trillion annual deficits and $36 trillion debt by attacking the federal workforce is mathematically impossible. But that is what they're trying to do by taking on this impoundment question.
And just to, at the risk of being overly flippant, it certainly feels to me like paying people not to work might be a lot of things, but efficiency is not one of them.
Exactly.
So I'd like to turn to questions. If we could see a question, what I'm going to do is sort of read the question, and then I'm going to ask any of our panelists who want to respond to do so. So
I'm just going to go ahead and read them aloud.
oh yeah, it's great.
Why are response views on impoundment seeming to win the current public debate? What is this group of experts doing to affect and inform the public debate? And on that, what is working and what is not working?
I can take a first shot at
Yeah,
that.
please.
The president has the bully pulpit. And right now, he's telling Americans that we are eliminating fraud, abuse, and waste. And that's all they're seeing. So the idea of eliminating fraud, abuse, and waste is a good idea. But when they understand the next layer of this, which is you are taking away soft power by cutting foreign assistance, you're making it more likely that chronic diseases will come to America because you're not attacking chronic diseases overseas. The notion that we make ourselves better by cutting off research and development in the next generation of science. When the American public understands what the consequences of it is, and this will take time, that will change. But right now, fraud is bad. And people are buying it.
Anyone else on that question?
I'll just say, I think we all do what is within our, from where we sit, what is the right thing for us to do. So I'm a teacher and I'm a scholar, and so I've been spending time trying to write things and trying to educate people about the current matter. And I think that's, in part just kind of like public debate. I think the way Charles set us out by saying that this affects everybody in the room from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to bed, because we rely so much on federal funding for the basic infrastructure of our lives. And so I think making points like that is critical.
And I would add that, I've talked to more reporters in the last 2 months than I probably have in the last, 5 or 10 years. I told a reporter 2 months ago that it had literally been almost 30 years since anyone asked me about the Impoundment Control Act, because of the point that Charles raised earlier, which is there was just an assumption that an appropriation bill had passed and signed into law, and the president was obligated to spend the money. So I think all of us are trying to do, as Eloise suggests, what we can within our own sort of areas of expertise to shine a light on this. Shining a light on things does not make them go away. It just illuminates, what is happening. It has to, none of us are in, sort of policy-making positions at this point. Another question.
If they recall correctly, as Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney attempted a pocket rescission of funding for the V-22 aircraft program he wanted to cancel, but was told it was impermissible. If anyone on the panel has insight on this circumstance, please elaborate.
There's only one person who can think of who might have insight.
Secretary Cheney thought investing in the V-22 was wasteful and unnecessary spending. Senator D'Amato, a member of the Appropriations Committee from New York, thought he was full of. He did not respect Secretary Cheney's view, and as a member of the Appropriations Committee, he succeeded in convincing the Congress to continue appropriating money for the V-22. Yeah. 30 years later, we still have it.
But I think it's an interesting broader point about the idea of law compliance. And law compliance works in the executive branch in two ways. It works because you think a court will tell you what not to do. And it works because you have an ongoing relationship with Congress as a co-equal branch of government to whom you need to return next year to get your next tranche of money. And so that's a form of, it is both kind of hard power and soft power, but in both dimensions with respect to courts and with respect to Congress, it requires this idea in the executive branch about the need to comply with the law in an interbranch system. And so I think the point is sort of a more general one as well. And it's interesting to reflect on that era and moment and to think about the law compliant nature of that response.
And just to equate it exactly back to what we've been talking about for the last year, if the president at the time had asserted the authority to impound, notwithstanding the fact that Congress went ahead and appropriated the money for the V-22, they might have just impounded it, and then we wouldn't have the V-22, which is an essential asset. Another example I'll give, 25 years ago now, Congressman Jerry Lewis of California appropriated money for something called a drone. And at the time, the administration thought that was futuristic, wasteful spending. If they'd had a impoundment authority, maybe we wouldn't have drones right now. Predators were an absolute essential feature of our war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So again, who's the decider?
Let me have one point here, because we've been very focused on the current fiscal year, which, as I pointed out, is drawing to a close. Optimistically, hopefully, a lot of what we're seeing is relevant for fiscal 25, right? So this continuing resolution that we're operating under is basically fiscal 24 funding levels and adjusted in quite a few different ways, but that's the base that we're working on. Going into next year, President Trump has proposed a budget. The Congress is now considering it. Now, whether appropriations are done on time or not, there will need to be another continuing resolution put in place that will be a Republican-led agreement between Congress and the White House. It seems to me that that should be a whole lot easier to comply with, but we'll see.
I want to add just one point. Charles made a really interesting point during his presentation about report language versus statutory language. And, a lot of what Eloise was talking about, where we have this sort of continual process of a stable relationship between the Congress and the executive, is because when you put things in report language, even though they're not in law, agencies know they're going to have to go back to that appropriations committee the next year. And if they don't comply with what's in report language, which to my knowledge, everyone has always said they cannot comply with it, and there's nothing illegal about that. But they comply with it because they want to sort of maintain those relationships. Now, will it really be true, as Charles suggested, that we end up seeing a lot more detail being put in statute because there's not the sort of adherence to complying with report language that there has been in the past. Next question, thank you.
What's the rule? Give us a good one. These have been good so far.
Currently, contractors who lost their funding argue they have standing because their contracts were awarded but then canceled. However, for funds that have been appropriated but not obligated yet, who would have standing since funds have yet to be awarded? In other words, how would cases like these make their way to the courts?
So I think that is the number one reason why appropriations law is not historically a judicialized space. It is because money that is merely appropriated to an agency to do something with, if it hasn't been obligated to a person who might have standing, there's just no way for those cases to come to court. So that is sort of the backbone of what I was talking about when I talked about how courts can only do a limited set of things that come to them with a limited set of claims around them based on a limited purview of what's at issue as opposed to the whole broader context of what's going on. That's the importance of the role of Congress. So I'll just flag another essay that I wrote this spring with some co-authors, Matt Lawrence and Zach Price, called Appropriations Presidentialism, where we make this very point that the courts can only do so much and that the broader context of dealing with the way the appropriations process works has to be a congressional one, and that the separation of powers and in fact the programs on which individual people rely, even if the money hasn't been obligated yet, can only really functionally be protected en masse if Congress is playing that role that the Constitution contemplates for it.
And under the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, federal government can cancel a contract for convenience. They don't have to have cause. So there's a great deal of flexibility in the executive to cancel contracts, producing the outcome that we just discussed.
Next question.
Does the Supreme Court ruling overturning Chevron impact reviewability? With gratitude for this panel from a former OMBer.
So does it affect reviewability? I don't really think it affects reviewability, which again is just this idea about is something committed to agency discretion, or if something is kind of sitting in with the president's. I think it actually makes, what it does is maybe make the claim that the individual statutes allow the non-spending a little harder because there's sort of a lack of deference to agency interpretation at that point. But I think it's kind of, unlike with most regulatory programs, I think this really is just kind of like an on the edges kind of argument. At least that's how I take it.
All right, anyone else on that? Another question?
Didn't Congress bring this impoundment fight on itself by failing to enact appropriations on time for 30 years?
Well, I'll try and see whether there's silence. I do think there's a point to be made that Congress would be on firmer ground if it had exercised its power of the purse more consistently over the last 30 years. And I think partially that's a public, almost a public opinion, kind of issue, in the sense that if somebody wants to sort of look at the Congress and say, well, the Congress hasn't been doing its job, therefore, maybe if the president had more power, things would be better. Now, I think the therefore isn't necessarily true, but I understand why it is that someone might, sort of have that reaction. Now, let me say that the Congress not passing appropriation bills on time, there are a lot of factors that sort of, play into that. And I don't think they should all be laid at the foot of the Congress. However, it is the Congress probably that gets the majority of blame for it. And
Let me add one thing to that. The budget process is broken. It's badly broken. People in this room have written that over time. And I think one of the things that this group is going to be focusing on in the future is how to reform that budget process. The name of our group is Reform for Results. And the budget process itself, and as Doug and I talked about earlier, the budget concepts that underlay that budget process. Sorry, Kiefer. I know that would be difficult for you, but we need to go back and look at those because those, as pointed out in Doug's excellent essay on the Budget Act of 50, those are where the shame lies. The fact that we have not complied with processes that we can't even really understand in some cases.
And I just want to say one thing, which is that I think looking at the budget process is broken in the context of the budget makes sense, but in the context of overall interbranch relations, the appropriations process is the one time every year that Congress has an opportunity to weigh in on what the executive branch is doing and to impose additional directions, to propose guidance, if you will, a report language to propose specific requirements on what the administration either can do or can't do. It can do it at a macro level, government-wide, it can do it at a micro level, program by program. So from the perspective of making sure that there is some check and some balance in the system, separate from funding the government appropriately, but just more generally thinking about the interbranch relations, I think the appropriations process is actually working about as well as anything is in government. And it's a critical feature for that kind of control of the executive branch. And so I want to kind of lean heavily into the idea that it is critical and that it does provide direction. So I don't think that Congress has brought this impoundment fight on itself.
Well, and I just to add one point, I think we have to really kind of understand in the context of what I think is a broken political process, what it is we should expect the budget process to do to fix that problem. I think our biggest problem is with our politics. Our biggest problem is with the extent of partisanship and polarization. I think the budget process problems are a symptom of that. And I'm not sure how it is that you would reform the budget process in order to make that larger problem go away, which is not to suggest there's nothing that could be done to reform the budget process. All right,
I'm sorry, but it's a chicken and an egg problem. If we can get people to agree the reforms necessary in the budget process, they will agree. An agreement is good.
Right. Yeah. So it is 3:28. So I think what I'm going to do is sort of ask the panelists if they have, sort of one more thing they want to say that they haven't been able to say.
I will say I have a report coming out next week in Brookings that analyzes 12 years of appropriations law decisions. And one of the things it finds is the consistent nonpartisanship of GAO findings. And so at this moment where GAO is being challenged as a partisan actor, I want to just flag this report coming out next week whose findings show the opposite, consistent straight shooter over the last 12 years of appropriations law decisions.
Charles, anything?
Pay attention, speak up. It affects you every day of your life.
We made it through this entire presentation without talking about the pending reconciliation measure. I know the term budget is very amorphous, but that reconciliation measure is focused on extending some tax cuts that are slated to expire, increasing spending for border security in the military, and cutting spending in other areas. It's very much related to this, but separate. We're talking about appropriations here, so I just want to make sure no one was confused by that.
And I'll just add one more point, which is that I actually think the power of the person, the separation of powers, is very important. And I think that we should think in terms. We should not be short-sighted here, even if one is a partisan Republican at this moment in time. I think one should not be short-sighted and think that if you cede power to the executive branch, that somehow means you're going to be able to get it back when you want it. I think that once power has been ceded from the Congress to the executive branch, it means every president will have that power, not just the ones that you agree with. So I would like to thank everyone, Arnold Ventures, Reform for Results, Charles Kiefer, Doug Costello, Eloise Tasikoff for a great discussion. Thanks to all of you for for tuning in. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of the questions, but there were some very good questions there.
And thanks, Sarah, for
Thanks.
helping us set this up.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.